Of course.
Oh, good evening and welcome to another one of our wonderful events. My name is Ben. I'm proud owner of Our Bookshop in Tring. I've been looking forward to this event so much, notwithstanding it's about 8 days after we finished our book festival, which and so I've basically been in a stupor for the last few days, recovering. So welcome back to everyone. Thank you, Helen, initially for helping out with the book festival. You assisted with dirt and you assisted with those wonderful women.
Yes,
Dare I say,
they took some controlling those women.
They did, extraordinary wartime women. Tessa Dunlop, now she's a number, isn't she?
She's quite a character. She's good fun.
Absolutely, but a wonderful evening that was. So tonight we're here to talk about Helen's book, which it came out, when did it, was it a couple of months ago?
Came out last month in October,
last month ago, Spymaster, and I'm absolutely riveted with this. I'm really excited to listen to this. So, and I'm last but not least, can I thank Roger as well? Roger, who is our eminent historian in Tring, who happens to live in Tring, but he's obviously a brilliant historian in his own right. So, and Helen and Roger know each other very well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to chat for the next 40 minutes. And audience, I want questions out of you, please. So put them in the Q&A. And if you're watching on the YouTube channel, clearly don't look for a Q&A button. So without further ado, over to you, Roger.
Thanks, Ben. Good evening, everyone. Good evening again to Helen.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again. You're putting us all to shame, as ever. Is this now 3 books in 3 years? Something like that, isn't it? I mean,
I'm glad you're counting, because I'm not Ben. No, you're not Ben. You're Roger. Sorry, I've clearly lost the plot.
But no, I mean, you're looking, remarkably productive at the moment, Helen, which is incredible. I mean, it takes me usually 3 years to produce a book, but you've produced a slew of them in the last few years. This being the latest.
But don't forget, it's been the result of nearly 20 years of research.
Yeah.
Because in the intelligence world, it's quite slow. The research world, the historical world.
So you store it up.
It's slow, but actually, sometimes it takes a while to fill some of the gaps. Yeah. Which was certainly the case with Spymaster. And of course, The Walls Have Ears is linked to that because Kendrick was head of that operation. Yeah. MI9, yes, okay, I did turn that around pretty quickly within 2 years, because I scoped the material and just controlled it fairly firmly. But those other 2 books, yeah, it took much longer. So it looks impressive. Yeah. Well, you can be impressed. I don't mind.
Hello, this is a biography of Thomas Kendrick. We'll come on to some of his sort of highlights later on, but I just wanted to have you start by telling us who he was, where he came from, how he came to be who he was, and all that sort of thing, how he came to be in place. We'll sort of start later on with him in Vienna, but how did he what's his early life up until that point?
Yeah, so tomorrow actually would be the anniversary of his birth. He was born on 26th November 1881 in Cape Town. So he was British, grew up in Cape Town, and in a world, quite a high society world, because his father, who was American, his mother was South African, bought the Hotel Metropole in Cape Town in the 1890s for a staggering £16,000. So it's like upper end. Yeah, so he's used to that kind of world which he would inhabit so well in the 20s and 30s. And then towards the end of the Second Boer War, he's enlisting in Her Majesty Queen Victoria's forces and is cycling behind enemy lines. Quite dangerous, actually, in this very tiny bicycle brigade. Yeah. So that's where he gets his taste. For 40 years.
Oh, you're back. You just froze there a minute, Helen. Do you want to can you just repeat that? I don't think it was just me. You said when he started joined forces in the Boer War, and you were just talking about the Cycle Brigade. Can you just repeat that a minute? Because you got frozen.
Yes, so the very small bicycle brigade At the age of 19, he's cycling behind enemy lines to gain intelligence. I mean, hugely dangerous. So he gets his first taste of those kind of dangerous ops, but he would go on to serve in British intelligence for the next 4 decades. And then, of course, it's more formalized after 1909, but he works for the Secret Intelligence Service and what we kind of now know as MI6. So he's at the heart of it from the very early days. And in the book, I trace some of those early figures and founders of the Secret Intelligence Service are there in South Africa at the same time as him. So some very interesting mix of people crossing in that early period. And that's something that hasn't been appreciated before.
Yeah, I noticed that. I've forgotten his first name, but Alexander Scotland was there as well. He's, of course, famous for the London Cage. He was also in South Africa at the same time.
He travels to South Africa. He then goes on in the subsequent years, crossing with Kendrick. The two of them are spying on the Germans in German Southwest Africa at a time when Germany is building up and is thought to be building new weapons. And okay, it's nothing like what we see developing in the Second World War, but nevertheless, there is the research there in terms of armament and rearmament. So Germany is certainly a threat. And it is interesting that the spying is taking place on the German occupying forces and areas in South Africa. And again, so it's so far removed from Europe that one doesn't think about that. And both men, Scotland and Kendrick, are working out of the diamond mining communities. And again, with those international links, I find some fascinating characters who again go on to work for British intelligence, but they're all meeting in that mix in the early part of the 20th century in South Africa.
So how does he end up in Vienna? When does this military career then switch to a diplomatic stroke intelligence one?
From 1925, he's posted to Vienna. So he has served in intelligence in the First World War, again with Scotland, with Stuart Menzies, who goes on to become the third head of MI6, Frank Foley, all these key characters, Claude Dancy. And then in 1925, he's posted to Vienna. He has about a paragraph or two in the official MI6 history, and that's kind of all we really know about him. But what we do know from that history is that Vienna in the 1920s, it actually says, was the most important SIS station in Europe. It's there at the crossroads, of course, between East and West. You have Vienna as replacing Paris as a centre of espionage. Paris in the First World War had been that centre. So he's placed there extraordinary because of his ability as a human spymaster. I mean, he was absolutely brilliant as would turn out in the next 13 years that he would be there. He would move completely with ease. And there is a suggestion also that he might have been chosen because he was Roman Catholic. He wasn't necessarily practicing, but on a very conservative, traditional Catholic country, that again, he might be able to move with ease, which he does amongst the Austrian aristocrats and intellectuals.
Yeah.
So he creates this and is part of this socialite, cultural world of cocktail parties and state opera. And he just loved it. He loved being part of that world.
So
but he was posted, sorry, I was just going to add there for the audience that he was posted as a British passport control officer, which was his cover. So he wasn't, as you know, Roger, doing any passport work or any visa work. Not at that point. He was just running spy networks into Eastern Europe and beyond. And
that was a very common cover, wasn't it, for SIS operatives? Was it it was the standard cover they were given, I think, right?
Yeah, so his colleague, Frank Foley, was posted to Berlin. So a very parallel post there, again, undercover for SIS.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting to see, you reference Vienna. It's almost like as a sort of hotbed of espionage, even in the 20s and 30s, I suppose. It's almost like, the third man, but, a couple of decades earlier than Green wrote it. It's quite an interesting image. Now, you talk about And one of the sort of headlines that came out of this book, I remember there was quite a few sort of newspaper articles on the back of this, talking about Kendrick as, again, the phrase you use is the savior of a generation. So his role in providing paperwork for fleeing Jews after 1938, after the Anschluss. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, because this is a period where his spy networks, his intelligence work comes under strain, because of course immediately after Austria's annex, this human catastrophe unfolds, and literally the following day he has hundreds, it's estimated, they don't know for sure, Foreign Office files say there are over 700 at least queuing round the British passport office, round down the street and around the corner. I mean, it was just complete chaos inside and out of Jews trying to flee, and there would be no let up for the time that he was there until the middle of August 1938, and we probably won't talk about what happens to him then. But he then embarks on this humanitarian mission, and the Foreign Office reports tell us he saved up to 200 Jews a day. Quite incredible legacy, and I think we need to understand that he wasn't just doing his job, he didn't have to mount such an intense rescue effort, which according to newspaper reports, he was working up to 15 hours a day with his SIS secretaries and his non-SIS staff. Of course, the non-SIS staff didn't know his secret role, which is really interesting, what's going on in the back rooms with secret ink and agents. So it's not, and he's not keeping to the visa rules when the situation becomes tricky and so many Jews can't get out, they don't qualify for emigration. One of them I talk about in the book and I interviewed is the late Lord George Weidenfeld. And he says at 19 he didn't qualify, he didn't have the right papers, he just did not qualify for emigration. And Kendricks he issued him with a temporary visa, which he was not allowed to do by that time, and got him out. And the poignant moment, I suppose, during that interview was when George just looked and said, what happened to the man who saved my life? And there was that whole period, 70, 80 years, when he had no idea what happened to Kendrick. So we had a really interesting conversation. And that was good because that was closure for him as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, and make that point very clearly, that to a large extent what he's doing is against the orders of London, effectively, because I mean that's the same summer of the Evian conference, which I've done some work on, which was supposedly called to try and provide, as these international conferences often are, was called to provide some sort of international response to the crisis, the Jewish crisis, a refugee crisis in Austria, and of course, as so often, the Evian conference ends with everybody wringing their hands and saying how dreadful it is, but doing precisely nothing, British included. So, I mean, it's important to note that Kendrick was going against orders doing this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've got a case of 1,000 temporary visas being issued, or visas for teenagers to go to what was then Palestine to attend a so-called sporting event. Well, Kendrick knew they weren't going to come back. I mean, that was the whole point. He started to use routes through Yugoslavia, and he got fingers wrapped by the Foreign Office really heavily. But any way he could get Jews and actually communists, those that he'd been spying on in the 20s and the early 30s, were also at risk. And one of the stories that has come to light is how he used a diplomatic card. I'm not sure if anyone else had done this, actually. Not read the story elsewhere with other spies and diplomats, but he would have a sign in the back which said Corps Diplomatique, so diplomatic corps, and he would smuggle 1 or 2 Jews out in the back. I mean, he himself couldn't drive, but he'd have a chauffeur drive them over the border. So he wouldn't use the same methodology time in, time out, because of course you get sussed out. But all these things, and the other thing he did was to put young children, in one case a 7-year-old boy, on the passport of a British businessman. And then when things got even tougher, particularly by May, June 1938, the government was really clamping down. He started to forge documents, forge passports, forge marriage certificates, anything to get people out. And irrespective of any consequences.
Yeah. And what sort of figures are we talking about? I mean, I think you you give an estimate of about 10,000, which is remarkable.
Well, that's what the newspapers have worked out. I'm not very good at maths, Roger. So 2,000 a day from the 12th, 13th of March 38 till the middle of August 38 when he's arrested. I mean, these are really dangerous times. So yes, it's probably about 10,000.
Wow.
We now know that some of them made it to Namibia. So there's a whole generation of people that contacted me suddenly have discovered his story. And we just thought perhaps they got them into Palestine, into United Kingdom. But anyway, he was writing furious letters to any parts of the British dominions to get people out. Had a lot of resistance from some of those governors, but he was pleading just to get people out. Incredible, smuggling them over the border into Czechoslovakia, while still trying to monitor. We mustn't forget, and again, this was when I was looking through Foreign Office files, you get a sense of just how dicey it was for Czechoslovakia between that May and that August. They're expecting an imminent invasion. So his networks, he's trying to ramp up those whilst working 15 hours a day on his rescue efforts.
That's a remarkable episode, at the end of which, in the summer of 38, then he gets arrested. How does that happen?
It's quite a dramatic part of the book. Traditionally, and if you read some of the histories of the British Secret Service, not the official history, but some of the earlier ones, his betrayal by a double agent was thought to have been his colleague Dick Ellis, who he actually lived with in retirement next door to later on. Keep your enemies close, they often say. But we now know that it wasn't Dick Ellis who betrayed him, but it was a Czech double agent by the name of Karl Tusek. And it is quite chilling how eventually he is captured. He's making a escape attempt over the border with his wife. He doesn't quite make it to the border. There's an assassination attempt on his life. He's hauled out of the car and sent back to Vienna without his wife. His wife goes separately with their chauffeur. And in all of this, it tells us one thing, and it's something which the family discussed with me. They're not quite sure when Kendrick's wife, Nora, ever found out really what he did. Clearly by his funeral, because there were some very mysterious guys in the back of the church in trench coats and trilby hats, just like your Le Carré novel. But at what point, certainly in the Vienna period, when she's helping him with those cocktail parties, he's gathering his circles, his intelligence, she's completely unwittingly part of this, and that protects her, because when the time of his arrest in the middle of August 38, she's not taken. But one of the first questions he's asked in interrogation, and he's got 8-hour like Soviet style interrogation, bright lights at night, little food, that kind of thing. The first question he is asked by his Gestapo interrogators is, where are the SIS, well, I'm saying SIS, but where are your secretaries? And they'd just made it over the border ahead of him, and they were in Kitzbühel, and then made it down to Amiens in France, where they were due to meet him and Nora. So they certainly suspected or knew or been told about the secretaries, but perhaps the agent said, look, his wife's got nothing to do with it. So she was spared, but he had a pretty rough ride for 4 days. Yeah. And there's this frantic toing and froing in Whitehall. How much of the SIS network has been compromised? How much has he given away? And you probably remember from the official history, it says it's the most serious incident to befall SIS in its first 30-year history. Yeah. It gives us an idea of just how tricky this was and how, potentially dangerous.
So, I mean, comparable in many ways to Venlo, which was the winding up of Dutch and German operations, wasn't it?
Yeah. So again, that would be the sort of within just 14 or 15 months later, in that November 39. Yeah, 2 of his colleagues taken on the border there between Holland, or the Dutch-German border at Venlo. Yeah.
So after that. After his capture and interrogation, then I think from memory, he's deported, isn't he? Arrives back in London.
Yeah, something that's quite topical, I guess, even still today. He's expelled for spying. which of course he completely denies. The government denies it as well, but we now know that actually he was one of our most senior spy masters in Europe at that time. So he flies back into Croydon Aerodrome and disappears from the public eye.
And what's next? 39 is looming, so where does he go from there?
Yeah, so we now know from a deeper dive into this that during 38, the rest of 38 and 39, he's doing two things. He's posted back to MI6 headquarters, the old headquarters in Broadway buildings. He is going to set up, with no blueprint, completely from scratch, a massive intelligence gathering organization that would go on to bug the conversations we've talked before of German prisoners of war and eventually Hitler's top commanders. But we now also know he was involved in handling agents. There's a very interesting letter. We don't know which agents and where, but he was certainly handling agents from Britain.
This bugging operation, which I mean, we've talked about before, and I know you've written about it before. And I've been to Trent Park, which I found fascinating. I mean, that's Trent Park stories, I wouldn't say well known, but it's been written about in the last few years. But what I found interesting here was that the origins of that was actually in the Tower of London with Kendrick.
Yes.
So that was already in 39.
Yeah, and that the stuff was written by me, Roger. Primarily, I'm the first person to tell it from a British perspective. So let's not forget.
Of course.
No, I'm rather proud of that work. It was a lot of hard work to put it together.
Yeah.
And to piece together the history. So it's not just a matter of lifting it from the archives, a part of that journey. But yeah, I love that. The fact that it starts in the Tower of London. I would love to see something there in the Tower of London today for this history, because we know which of those parts of the Tower of London that we use, and they're so atmospheric. It'd be wonderful to reconstruct something there or have some explanatory panels, but I guess they're concentrating on the much earlier history.
Yes,
but I think the public would find it fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think that should definitely happen. We should collectively make that happen, Helen. I think one point that struck me was interesting. You mentioned this sort of intertwining with people like Scotland. Who sort of crop up in the story all the way through. And now Scotland's later enterprise, which you've also written about, the London Cage, certainly had a reputation for, I would say, methods bordering on torture, if not sort of psychological discomfiture. And yet Kendrick's methods, as you stress through the book, are very much sort of softly, aren't they? They're sort of befriending people, and at least, I mean, bugging them is one thing, but it's very much a sort of a hands-off and a sort of a softly approach. Is that a sort of a fair distinction to draw, or not?
Yeah, so I think the question that still remains outstanding with regard to Colonel Scotland is whether he was acting on his own initiative, really, when he's a bit near the mark. He doesn't really have the backing of the intelligence services, although people think that perhaps he did. So Kendrick always completely disavowed any use of, coercion. Having said that, from his sites, if there were, particularly in 1946, when we had those die-hard Nazis, the SS, that had been guilty of the Sargon, the famous Sargon trial eventually. And it's on tonight, actually, Great Escape. So at 9 o'clock, you can see me again on Channel 5, Great Escape. But those 50 Allied airmen that are shot, that have escaped from Stalag Luft 3, they end up in the London Cage. If they're not going to give up any information, certain prisoners of war during the wartime itself, if they were not going to give up intelligence, which we believe they had, vital intelligence, then they could be moved to the London Cage. It's not clear how much Kendrick knew of the methods that were necessarily going on at the London Cage, and whether they even continued to meet after the wartime. We don't know. The family don't remember Colonel Scotland.
Right.
They remember Norman Crockett, the head of MI9, but they don't remember Colonel Scotland. So who knows? But that belief that really only reliable intelligence can be gained through the softly approach was something which Kendrick was good at.
Yeah. I liked that there was talking about Kendrick's methods. I like those little vignette that you gave there, which was of prisoners. I think we're talking about in Trent Park, I imagine, maybe Latimer House, I don't know. A vignette was given of prisoners being called to an interrogation, which was kind of very, very casually and rather cack-handedly done, and then they're sent back to the cell, and of course the cell is bugged, and they say, well, that was a shambles. We didn't divulge any of our information, and then discuss all of their information.
Yeah.
But it's that ruse I thought was a wonderfully British way of doing things, I thought.
Well, that starts in the Tower of London like that,
Right.
the idea of the phony interrogation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, all kinds of things. And the use of stool pigeons, we've probably discussed that before, where initially it would be a British officer, Olivia Newton-John's father, Bryn.
Mm-hmm.
Newton-John was one of those stool pigeons, who would be in the cells or in the room and would lead the prisoner. If the prisoner was slightly security conscious, the stool pigeon might say, well, let's go over by the window because they could be listening outside the door. Because there's a microphone in the windowsill, everywhere, or out in the exercise yard. And they say, well, let's go over the, and they'd be stood in the tree that's bugged. And of course, the prisoners had, I just love this, nothing is quite what it seems.
Yeah.
And Kendrick was helped in this whole theatrical stage set, if you like, by another intelligence officer, Arthur Rawlinson, who in the pre-war period, pre-World War II, was a script writer. He wrote scripts for films.
Mm.
So you can imagine, and the two of them just chuckling, settling down, kind of almost writing the script for what's going to unfold in the wartime.
No, it's a wonderful, wonderful episode. That I enjoyed that a lot. Another episode that looms large in your book, of course, is that of Rudolph Hess's arrival in May of 1941. And Kendrick also sort of plays a key role in how Hess's detention develops. So can you tell us a bit about that as well?
It is, and I'm very interested in the work that historian Michael Smith has done, largely through his biography of Frank Foley. Frank Foley also being one of the minders alongside Kendrick of Rudolph Hess in 1941. That whole idea that actually Hess was expected. And I think that's now the accepted interpretation, that Hess came here because he was lured here by MI6. So for about 4 months, Kendrick left the bugging operation and joined Frank Foley and a mysterious Mr. Barnes. And the three of them were the minders of Hess at Matchett Place near Aldershot. And of course, Kendrick's given a code name, Colonel Wallace. He's in the bedroom next to Hess. Mm-hmm. And I think in the end, they didn't really get any intelligence towards the end out of him, although there is some intelligence that Hess gives up, but we think it's exaggerated. We now know from the bugged conversations of the prisoners that Hess was correct. For example, Hess was saying, well, we're producing 1 U-boat a week. And we didn't believe him. But there's other stuff as well. And Hess very much believed that we would do a deal. He said, look, the threat's the Russians, not us. But how much intelligence they really got from him, you'd have to read my comments in the book. But he was mad. And Kendrick got quite fed up with him, I think. He thought that Kendrick and the others were trying to poison him. He would often swap his dinner with Kendrick. Yeah. So you get a real insight into that strange world. It must have been very weird, mustn't it, being holed up with Rudolph Hess for 4 months.
I liked that reference that you made to what Hess called Mexican brain poison, which I thought was referring to mescaline. I gleaned from what you wrote.
Yes.
What you wrote. But I thought that was a lovely phrase, that presumably he got the word mescaline mixed up with Mexican.
Or whoever was transcribing it did.
Oh, whoever was transcribing, yeah. I thought that was a lovely touch.
Conversations with his guards and his minders. Not all the transcripts, I don't think, are released, just sometimes little reports. But that's interesting. So Kendrick arranged for that to be wired for sound. But the whole thing about truth drugs, of course, I do raid the London case. It's not obvious users of war, but naval intelligence teams certainly, from declassified files, we know in November 1939, Ian Fleming's lot were experimenting with so-called truth drugs on themselves, which is which is not something I think I'd want to try. And in one case, I think it's an MI5 officer, because he's described as a civilian, he's ended up on the floor, he's had too much.
Wow.
It's mad.
Well, it's probably an unfair question, but given that you discussed the Hess affair to at some length, there are still files withheld on Hess, aren't there, from memory? So, I mean, when do you think, if ever, we'll know the final story on Rudolph Hess?
Well, it depends which period of Hess's life. I mean, as we both know, there are still these awful conspiracy theories around his death and what did or didn't happen to him. But even before that, the whole around his treatment, there have been suggestions that it wasn't, of course, not him at Nuremberg. We certainly know the files for his period in the Tower of London have not been declassified, because I asked for them.
Yeah.
And I was told no.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, what would be particularly sensitive, but I guess if it's a matter of national security, then we're not going to get them, and we have to respect that.
So I mean, the problem for those of us that try to combat the conspiracy theorists is, of course, that the conspiracy theories grow in the gaps between what we know, and the gaps are sort of propagated by the lack of information like this. So it does become rather frustrating, and as we said earlier on, it's very often rather opaque as to precisely why a file is kept back when it's eventually released. You can look at that file and say, well, there's nothing particularly interesting or sensitive in there to modern eyes. So it's sometimes rather opaque as to why they're kept back at all, isn't it?
It's true with one of the Kendrick files, because I asked for anything to be released on him when I was writing the book, and stuff was released to me, nothing sensitive, but a couple of folios, as they call them, pages were withheld. And it was an interesting category, one I'd not had before, and something like in the interest of international security.
Wow.
Well, we can't speculate what on earth that might be. Yeah,
indeed. Well, watch that space and see if they're ever released. Now, just to sort of begin wrapping things up, you used the phrase on the subtitle of the book, "The Man Who Saved MI6." Why did you say that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think it's important to preface this by saying I didn't think of the subtitle, although I agree with it.
Okay.
My publisher, Yale, didn't think of the subtitle either. It was the reviewer. I don't know who the reviewer is. The reviews are always anonymous. If you put together a proposal, as you know, Roger, you have to put together a lengthy proposal. Publisher reads it, goes before the board, and they say yes. Goes to an academic who says, yes, this is worth publishing. It's not rubbish, kind of thing. And it was that academic who, at the end, words to the effect of, "Oh my gosh, this man saved MI6."
Uh-huh.
And it really has to go back to the period where Kendrick is expelled from Vienna and the Venlo incident. If you look at that period when MI6 is starved of funds, I came across an intelligence report, Director of Naval Intelligence, on the state of SIS. And it's very clear in there, it says that until the end of 1942, SIS was struggling to get any proper intelligence from agents behind enemy lines, and the only real intelligence we were getting was the special intelligence from Kendricks sites and from Bletchley Park. So he also goes on to provide the foundations which do enable MI6 to survive and to provide intelligence ahead of the Cold War. And this was a deeper dive into that whole bugging operation that I'd done in the Walls Have Ears. I had a chance not just to sort of copy all of that, but two things I think are important to say here, if I might. And the first is, for a long time, all those years I was working through this stuff, I was thinking to myself, there's a heck of a lot of Russian stuff in here. And then the penny dropped when I was looking at this, and somebody said to me that their mother, the only thing she ever spoke about of her work for Kendrick at Latimer House was that before 1943, we were struggling for any intelligence on the Russians. In the period that they were our allies, we were not spying on them. They now were emerging as a long-term threat. And so a lot of the intelligence we were getting came particularly from the German generals, but also from those soldiers that had fought on the Russian front, on Russian capability. And so that's interesting in itself, that it's not only about winning the war against Nazi Germany, but it's also during that war providing us with intelligence for the next threat. And the final thing I would say also, which I think is relevant, is that at the end of the war they had really important administrative scientists capture General Dornberger, and he'd been in charge of the whole secret weapon program, overseeing it since 1932. And I was told, and I think I've said this to you before, made this comment, it was the most important interrogation ahead of the Cold War. And in that period, Kendrick's officers are compiling really thick reports, some of them 15, 20, 30 pages long, on every aspect of Nazi Germany. I mean, everything you can think of, infantry, flak, cryptology, scientists, and you realize there wasn't anything. And this is all the stuff they got from the bug conversations. So it's a massive legacy which he leaves going into the Cold War. So I think that's a really important understanding that's coming out of his life.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think you've put him back on the map in that sense. That's a remarkable achievement for someone who, as you said, prior to your work, really qualified only for a couple of paragraphs in the standard history. That's a remarkable thing to put him back on the map like that. I think that's a fantastic achievement. So,
but those are the characters
wonderful.
we have to be kind of a bit suspicious of, maybe if they've only got a small amount in the official history. Sometimes they are the most important in its history.
Yeah, wonderful,
isn't it?
Absolutely. Wonderful. I can only recommend the book, I have to say. I mean, as with everything you write, Helen, it's beautifully done. It's impeccably researched, utterly convincing. So, congratulations. I urge everyone out there to rush out and buy one if they haven't bought one already from Ben. It's a fabulous book. So thank you very much. Hopefully we'll have a few questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Been a fascinating little chat, actually. So, virtual audience, we're looking for your questions. I say virtual; it's not a hybrid gig, is it? So, we're looking for your questions as well. Margaret started with a cracker, actually. Hello, Helen. I love listening to your knowledge about espionage. Do you keep an eye on current espionage? I didn't realise there was a current sort of espionage movement. Would you make a good spy?
Okay, so no, I don't do anything contemporary. I've just, hooked, I suppose that's the right word, isn't it? I just love all these intelligence stories from a historical perspective. I don't really keep an eye. I mean, I do have opportunities sometimes to attend seminars on contemporary crises and threats as an academic or as a historian, but I don't have the time, to be honest, to keep up to date with most of the contemporary stories other than what you get through the news channels. But I think there's still so much that we can talk about. From the Second World War, there are files being released all the time, but there are so many files which, as you know, Roger, historians haven't looked at properly. The Hess files are a classic example of where I went back into them, and there's quite a lot of stuff on Hess. People were saying, oh my gosh, where'd you get all this stuff from? Well, I got it from the files that you looked at. Yeah, people just tend to miss and not make the links. And so I think there's so many stories still from that period that can enrich our understanding of the wartime. I love that period and early Cold War. So I agree. Might move beyond.
I agree completely with that, Helen. I think as well, one of the things that frustrates me is sort of when, like, popular history is a spectrum, but the sort of really popular end of it, where perhaps the author's barely seen the inside of an archive, And a lot of it is just sort of retreading of what everyone's done before, and that to me just gets rather boring. Might be slightly better written, or there might be another voice, another sort of memoir inserted here or there. But actually, what's interesting is to really try and change the narrative where it needs changing, and that's what you do with this. Like I said, you've put Kendrick on the map where he just wasn't there before, and that's a remarkable achievement.
I think it's very interesting. If I've got time, just to say, it's a very interesting story. Something that happened to me a few years ago. I was giving a talk in a venue in London, in a club, and quite a large audience. You can't really kind of see the faces at the back. Afterwards, these young lads came up to me and said, "Oh, can we buy you a drink at the bar?" And I said, "Yes, yes." They said, "When you showed a picture," I was talking about the bugging operation of the wartime, and the first photograph was of Kendrick in Vienna. And they said, when you showed that first photo, there was a gasp from the front 2 rows. I mean, I didn't hear it. I was way back up the front. And they said, one of us, we leant forward and said to these, what's the fuss about? And one guy turned around and said, "This man is legendary in MI6 circles." And for me, that was the first insight that I really had to dig deep, that we've got some stuff on the surface, but I think now that I have finished this fuller biography, I've come to appreciate, and somebody's written a review, I don't know who it is, somebody's written a review on Amazon, which says that Kendrick's legacy is immeasurable. And I'm so pleased that Yale have published this biography.
And
they took a punt.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know, absolutely, and thoroughly well deserved. Have you got another question there, Ben?
I was just fed from where. I mean, Helen, where do you decide to take your sort of, obviously your last book or your last 2 books, you had Walls Have Ears and then MI9, and now this one. Do they kind of feed from each other? Do you think actually and you divert from one book to the next? So is there a diversion from maybe the next one as well? As an added question, have you got a diversion to take off from this one?
Yes. Of course, but don't worry.
Are you allowed to tell us?
Yes. Shall I? I haven't kind of made it too public, but across the last 20 years, out of these books, there's quite a few stories which have begin to emerge, which I've discovered, which I think other historians, just because the way I work, and as you find, Roger, you're finding different stories than I find in my research, that I don't think people will tell. So I'm going to bring those stories together, but I'd rather not say publicly at the minute what the book is. But if you ask me next year when it's delivered, but you've got another year after that before it's published. So
well, thank God. I mean, the rest give the rest of us a chance to get a look in, really.
Well, I have been working on it for the last year amongst everything else and trying to but it's not starting totally from scratch, but it's still a lot of work.
Yeah. I'm reminded talking about Hess. I had a book that I wrote a while ago, the 100 Objects, Third Reich and 100 Objects. There was a wonderful story that I found. And one of the objects that I had was Hess's long johns. Which were I mean, you might know this. They're actually in the archive of the Imperial War Museum.
No.
Yeah.
Are these the ones that were found behind the safe when MI6 moved its building? Because this is in John le Carré's, David Cornwell's memoirs, Pigeon Tunnel. Right.
Well,
do you remember that?
They were confiscated from him, so by MI6 or SIS. So they could well have ended up there. Yes, because what they wanted. I mean, this is like researching it, which I did for that piece. What they wanted was to find out something compromising about Hess. So the theory is that they were expecting him to be wearing sort of silk, frilly underwear or something they could give to the Daily Express and sort of splash on a Sunday to sort of, help the war effort in that way. And then they found out they were sort of, standard, woolen long johns, Luftwaffe issue or whatever it was. And, I mean, Hess was a very peculiar man, as you well know, but he was something, a bit like Hitler. He's a bit of an ascetic as well. So he wasn't into wearing frilly knickers, for God's sake. So, but anyway, so they confiscated his underwear, realized there was absolutely no propaganda potential in there at all. And then, as you said, dumped them in the office of MI6, which is a wonderful story. But that's what came to mind when we were talking about Hess earlier on.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Talking about going back to the gaps in the files, when I went back and looked at the files again, there's this episode, so it's been declassified, so it's perfectly okay, but I thought, oh gosh, isn't this a bit sensitive? But there's a report there which says Hess has woken up from his unconscious state that he's been in for the last month. And I thought, well, I haven't read that in any not quite sure why he was unconscious for a month, but it was some very strange affair, but that has been declassified.
Yeah.
But yeah, little things like that could be significant that historians have missed. So you and I were for looking in those archives for the gems.
So there's a few questions lined up. Liz asks, how do you do your research? I mean, obviously, what is the? I mean, to the layman like you and, well, not you, but like me and probably a lot of people watching, where do you go to get all these classified files and all these? Who do you ask? So she asked, how do you do your research? And she said, you must have read so many documents.
Yes, thousands upon thousands of documents. In fact, somebody wrote to me recently asking for some help. I didn't actually have the stuff they needed, but they said, oh, I can't be bothered to trawl through the archives. And I thought, no, that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
You can't just have it handed. I could have missed something. So when you've got a subject you're writing about, could be the birds on the wall behind you there, Ben, something like that. If that's what you're going to be writing about, you have to try and scope where material might be, whatever you think, however you've set out the parameters of your book. So being serious on Kendrick, for example, much harder because I had no access to the MI6 archives. I've only worked on declassified material, and that's why it's taken so long to write the book. I've written books in between because I might have the first bit, just a few sketchy things from the family, and then the Second World War period, which had been released, the War Office files. But there's a whole kind of area that still hasn't come out, but we've got enough. But so I'll give you a more concrete example with the MI9 book, The Escape and Evasion. I basically scoped how much was in the National Archives and thought, my gosh, thousands upon thousands of files. So you have to try and manage that and make a relatable story, so it continues to turn the page, and then look for other archives, key archives that might be relevant. Imperial War Museum, of course, National Army Museum, and there may be somebody you already know who has an archive in an attic, and they might know somebody else who's kept in touch because they're, I don't know, their two aunts are in MI9 or something like that. But it does take time, and you just start working. And then, of course, there are some loose ends. You think this is relevant. So you then go back to the archives to think, what is there on this? I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if that's how Roger does his research.
No, very similar. I mean, I think that's a remarkable skill as well that you have there, because it's working with archival material. It can often be quite sort of dry, and you've got to sort of pull out the, if the light, the diamond from the coalface very often. And actually that's the fun bit, I would say, in answer to Liz's question. That's the fun bit, is being in the archive and looking for those diamonds. It does sometimes take a lot of sifting, as you know, Helen. And at the same time, you also have to allow all of that material to inform you as to how you're going to take the narrative forward. Because what you're doing is creating a functioning narrative, which is as close as you can make it to how you perceive how things were, out of what were essentially records of chaos. Because life is chaos. There's things recorded, there's things that aren't recorded. Everything is there in some form, and usually in a haphazard fashion. And your job as a historian is to make sense of it, as well as looking for the diamonds. So it's sort of a twofold process, isn't it?
I have to say, that this is what defines you two as standout historians compared to some of the more, dare I say it, celebrity historians who regurgitate. I mean, obviously, Roger, you made the point earlier about regurgitating well-known topics that will sell books, and I think you two are both to be massively applauded for being those sort of historians who will go into the archives and will trawl when others don't. And Helen, you gave that example at the start. Stephen Rees, great discussion. a few points. Should Kendrick be recognised as Yad Vashem in Jerusalem?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I've now put in an application, and I don't want to say anything which might appear undiplomatic, but I did, and there's different people there now, but I did try about a decade ago. And that was the response, sort of, you know, it needed eyewitness accounts, and he was only doing his job. And that was the point I was making with Roger earlier, very important. He wasn't just doing his job. Frank Foley has been recognised, as we know, the likes of Nicholas Winton, the Oscar Schindlers of the world. And I'm really hoping the evidence, I've got one veteran who was saved by Kendrick, who passed away last month, who did sign a statement earlier this year. He wrote in his words and then signed it. So I think we've got enough evidence now for him to be recognised, and I seriously hope he will. In fact, the Jewish Chronicle mounted a campaign to support this in early October, and did a whole 4-page massive spread, including the front cover, clearly saying we're backing this campaign. So I hope we get some good news on that. I would like to see it happen within the lifetime of Kendrick's granddaughter. She's approaching 90. She was born in Vienna and witnessed, she remembers the Nazi regime. So she was born in the very early 30s. And it would be lovely if that could happen in her lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely applaud that. I think that's a wonderful sort of testament to what he did in that period in Vienna. I think that would be wonderful if he could be recognised. So I agree with that entirely.
Yeah, Stephen's question does continue. I have broken it down actually. Can Kendrick be added to the likes of Schindler? And you obviously referenced Schindler moments ago.
Can I add something in here, actually? 'Cause it just reminds me, when that first article came out in the Jewish Chronicle, it was the 1st of October, you can Google it. Somebody contacted me via my website afterwards and asked to have a chat. And they said to me, somebody I hadn't met before, said, you know how important it is for people like Kendrick, because to be recognised, because they had somebody, a rescuer, who'd rescued their family. And they didn't know if it rescued any other families, but their family. And they said, very moving actually, said, I want to leave this earth knowing that that righteous Gentile has been recognised. And I thought, for these families that have been rescued, it's so important to them. And again, that was a dimension I hadn't thought of before, that there are people out there who know they've been saved by certain righteous Gentiles, but they are struggling to get them recognised. And it was just that comment. I want to make sure that by the time I leave this planet, you know, that person's been recognised. So it's touched the chord.
Yeah.
That's such a moving statement for a historian to listen to, isn't it? I mean, that's it almost sits in your hands.
That last point on Stephen Reese's question there is quite a good one, which I came across in the book, obviously, but I had it on my list even of questions, but I didn't get around to it. Is that connection to Philby, which is intriguing, because Philby was supposedly recruited in Vienna during that period that Kendrick is there. So they must have come across each other in some form. What can you tell us about that?
I do say in the book, I'm not sure if they met face to face, but please read really carefully what I've put there, because that kind of bothered me. So Philby's there, isn't he, in 33, 34. He's helping the communists. He's down in the sewers of Vienna. He's crossing with Kendrick's known agent, the journalist Eric Geddy. And it's always been assumed, so Philby's finally recruited to SIS in around 39. Some people put it later at 1940. Okay, it's only a year. Who is he working for at that point? And he's not recruited as a penetration agent till he comes back to London in 34, after he's married. That period is really, really interesting. And I do question, was he loosely working for Kendrick at that time? Because the other figures there, if you look, it's about the people in the places at the time. Hugh Gateskill, who goes on to work in Kendrick, he's in Vienna that summer. The whole raft of these interesting characters, including the American journalist Dorothy Thompson. She's also has links potentially to intelligence work, and Naomi Mitchison. But Philby's interesting because people say, how could SIS have missed him in 1939? And I just raise that question, did they miss him? Because when he married Litzy Friedman in Vienna, obviously she was then entitled to a British passport, and Kendrick issued the passport. He was too clever. He would not miss. He had actually completely formulated the communist network in Vienna and the Soviet spies working undercover in those networks. How could he possibly miss Wurlitzer Friedman? How could he possibly miss Philby? There you go.
Do any of Philby's sort of biographers and so on come to the same conclusions on that? Because that seems to be an obvious answer that you just gave, but at the same time, it's quite revelatory. Yeah.
No, it's new, and there's also this whole area. They were friends with another leading communist, Edith Shushitsky, who becomes Edith Tudor Hart. She is definitely being tracked. She's the one that introduces Philby to Arnold Deutsch, the penetration agent, on a park bench. I believe it's Regent's Park here in London, after April 1934. So that seems obvious to me. You know, people have said before, oh, you know, they've missed it. They didn't. I have now got in the declassified files, I've seen the evidence where Vivian Valentine, I don't get the wrong way over, VV, counter-espionage in SIS. He's writing and talking about our man in Vienna, and he's sending to Kendrick saying, you know, keep an eye on this woman, kind of thing. So they're definitely, you know, penetrating those networks, but how far, we don't know. But of course, interestingly, if it is true that Philby was working for Kendrick loosely in that period, it doesn't change what happened on that park bench in London a year later. But Philby's there a very long time, and he's also there with some other key intelligencers. So do read that period, some really key figures. Douglas Holmes' brother, for example, a whole raft of them there.
And it's one of the most amazing things from what we talked about tonight, and from reading your book as well, Helen, is that how someone, admittedly, is in secret intelligence. His job is living in the shadows, to a large extent. But how someone can have been sort of touched so many other prominent lives and so many other prominent events, and yet remain almost entirely unknown to, you know, people like us until you get to your subject. I find that quite remarkable.
It is. He's living completely in the shadows, but even his family, you know, it goes back to what we said about his wife. At what point, and it must have been pretty late, did she find out what he was really doing? We just don't know. It may have been after the war, because if you think about it, in the First World War and in the Second World War, he's back in uniform. So intents and purposes, he's in France at one point. She's not with him at that point. But during the Second World War, she's in Oxshott in Surrey. He's staying at his secret sites, but he does come and visit. And when he comes to visit, he rings her up one day and says, oh, I've just got a few generals coming for afternoon tea. She asks no questions. He turns up in his military uniform. He's working for the War Office, as far as she can tell. So it's a very interesting question. We might never know. And the whole point is, of course, it's this whole world of shadows. And the family get to some insight at his funeral. There's something, you know, who are those mysterious figures? So there would be these comings and goes. She must have known at some point, but I think it must have been pretty late. So she brings out the tea and the cucumber sandwiches and entertains the generals. He's in his military uniform. Why would she think he was doing anything else? And MI6 didn't officially exist. I
suspect she was smarter than we all expect, and actually just thought, I don't want to know. I just stay out of it. But listen, we are coming to a close. I'm conscious. Helen, you've already answered that you're doing something a bit cloak and dagger, and you can't tell us yet. Roger,
you'll enjoy it though.
Yeah, you're talking about Yad Vashem and Righteous Among the Nations and all of that. I'm working on a book about what was known as the Ładoś Group, which was a group of Polish diplomats and Jewish activists working out of Bern in Switzerland during the war, and were systematically forging Latin American passports that were then smuggled into occupied Poland for Jews to escape. And it's about that operation, and it's about how the Germans responded, what they did in response, what the Swiss do in response, what the British and the Americans do in response. It's actually a really interesting story, and rather like Kendrick, who we did the maths, and we reckon he's saved about 10,000 people. The estimate is that the Waddush group issued something like 10,000 passports, and they reckon that of those, perhaps 3,000 survived. So it's a substantial figure, and this is during the Holocaust. This isn't saving them before the fact, as it were. This is arguably a slightly harder job of getting them out of the camps and the ghettos of occupied Poland. So it's a really interesting story. Like we said earlier on, it's kind of new stuff because it's not been written before. So that's difficult and exciting at the same time. And I have to finish that by next summer, and then it'll be out in 23.
Brilliant.
23. Wow. Good. Well, listen, it's been amazing. We've just clicked over the hour, so thank you so much, the pair of you, for joining us. It's been an absolutely brilliant hour, and I'm always gutted when I have to end these things. Helen, keep up the good work. Roger, keep up the good work. The pair of you are legends, really. You're so good, and I'm so proud that I get to ploy the pair of you from time to time, and you also assist with other events as well. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't got the book, or you haven't ordered the book, come and get it. I've got signed copies, obviously, and also Helen's back catalogue and Roger's back catalogue as well. So good. That's it. Thank you very much, Helen. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ben. All the best.
Thank you.
We'll see you very soon, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.